Welcome to the Weird Warriors podcast. On this podcast, we will be covering the Weird War Tales comic book series published by DC Comics from 1971 to 1983. I'm Max.
I'm Rich.
And in this episode, we are going to take a look at Weird War Tales #1, which was cover dated September to October 1971, on sale July 1st, 1971. And the price of this book when it came out was 25 cents. A little blurb says only 25 cents on the cover. Now, speaking of that cover, we have, I think, one of the best logos of any comic series I've ever read, with the word weird outlined in bold, and each letter is just filled with a pile of bodies. It's pretty macabre, actually, for a series that came out in 71, I think. You know, so you have weird, and then war is just in red below that. And then the feature illustration on the cover is a skeleton wearing nothing but a military coat, helmet, and boots. No pants, which we'll talk about, I bet. But and holding a rifle with a bunch of scared American soldiers scattered on the ground. The skeleton, of course, is wearing Nazi regalia, and it is drawn expertly by the living legend, Joe Kubert, who I think does many, many, many covers for this series, if not the majority of them.
Joe Kubert actually, I think, did the covers of like all DC war books, whether he drew a single panel on the inside or not. And Joe Kubert usually did the covers for all these books, and quite well, I must say.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to sell your books really any time in history, but especially over at DC in the 70s, you pretty much just got, you got Joe to come over and crank one out for you. And I think he had a position in the company at some point. I don't know if he was ever art director, but he did definitely have a position at DC for a bit, where he was making decisions like this and not just taking jobs. So yeah, we have that cover. We have DC Weird War Tales also on the cover in the upper left corner inside the shape of a tombstone, titles for the 3 stories contained within, and then a little memo, like a card that supposedly was dropped onto the cover that says official memo. And I am gonna mess up the pronunciation of that first word, but it says Gefreiter Hans Mueller died 2 days ago, or so he thought.
You actually got that pretty good, I would have to say.
All right. Well, the only way I know how to do any of that is probably from bad movies where they got a lot of the other stuff wrong. But hey, we're also reading comic books where they got a lot of stuff wrong, which we'll get to. So what we're going to do here is synopsize different parts of the book and then discuss them as we go on. So when you first get into this series, you first open the book, we have a framing sequence, and it's about 4 pages long. Now, the reason there's a framing sequence is, as people may be aware, and if not, we'll let you know, the first, I think, 7 issues of this series are largely comprised of reprint material?
Yeah, that's what I got out of it.
So what they did was Joe Kubert himself, at least in this issue, wrote and drew a little framing sequence to try to stitch these stories together into one loose narrative. So where we start out is in 1944, winter. The damp cold invades the trees, condenses on the rifle, grips the man. And so what we have here is a lone soldier kind of staggering through the woods in the cold alone. And then a shell is fired, and he's buried in exploded debris and left for dead. He recovers enough to stumble in pain until he happens upon a strange house in the middle of nowhere, and he passes out. And this old man picks up the unconscious soldier and brings him into the house. Then there's a panel where the soldier has a nightmare specifically about the trees in the forest growing mouths and trying to eat him, which I don't think we follow up on, but, great visual.
Dream sequence.
And, Joe Kubert, man, I'm not going to argue with it. So when the young soldier awakens, he's laying in a bed, he's been taken care of, and the old man bids him to rest and listen to his stories of the many things he's seen. And in the drawing, when they close in on the old man, his eyes are tiny little skulls. So it's like, probably just symbolic, but that's the first hint of anything even kind of supernatural that we get here. We don't get an actual title But in Mike's Amazing World of Comics, where I got a lot of the data for this book, they call this intro, "Let me tell you the things I've seen," which is part of the final word balloon before we get into the first short story here. So what do we think about this framing sequence?
Well, like you said, it was done by Joe Kubert, and this was primo, top of his game, Joe Kubert. This was, he didn't get any better than this. The inking, the shading, the look of terror on this soul scout's face as he's walking through the woods, and then just the smoke rising off the debris after the shell fires at him. He's sweat's pouring down his face. He's in pain. He's dragging himself to the house. I mean, just bottom line, Joe Kubert, just boom. I mean, he is without a doubt my favorite, one of my favorite comic artists, and I am very, very grateful I had an opportunity to meet this man and get his signature on a bunch of the old classic war books, including the first and last issue of Sergeant Rock and the first appearance of Unknown Soldier. So
now, did you meet Joe just the one time?
Yes, actually, he was at a Comic-Con, one of the New York Comic-Cons. I went down there expressly to meet him.
Yeah.
And it was actually a unique circumstance because his two boys, Andy and Adam, who do comic work with him, were there at the table with him. So I got to meet all three of them. I got all their signatures on one book or another. Heck, Sergeant Rock 422, that was the last book. And all three of them did work on it. And even they were making fun of the tagline on the top of the cover of the book. So like, Kubert, triple threat, Joe, Andy, Adam. And they're like, oh, man. But all three of them signed it. So that was a great meet. Yeah, Joe's art is just phenomenal. I mean, he is...
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Rich Fulham goes to meet people at a comic book convention. He does it right. You're not just going to meet like this one Kubert. You're going to meet all three of them. You're going to have a book all three of them worked on and then have a laugh about it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
you had pretty good luck with meeting people at conventions, I'd say.
Whenever I go to a show, I mean, like, I don't recall what exactly I said in the last episode, but my collection is getting to the point where I'm not going to find the stuff that I'm looking for in local stores anymore. I've got to go to the big cons or something like that, or go to eBay or whatever. But whenever I go to a big con, I look at the guest list and I see who's going to be there. And if it's just like, if there's some guy like, hey, I haven't met Garth Ennis yet, and he's going to be there, I'll go through my collection and I'll find 2 or 3 books, or just to hopefully get to the front of the line and have him sign one of them, or John Romita Jr. or Jim Lee or whatever else like that. I mean, the show that I met Joe Kubert at, Joe Simon was at. It was one of the last shows he was at, before he died. And I happened to have a Captain America on me. You want to talk about getting lucky? Holy God. So yeah, I do my homework before I go to a con. Because especially the greats, they're all leaving us. There's not very many of the old timers left anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, I've never been big on getting signatures, really. Which kind of limits you when you're meeting a writer. I mean, one of the few signatures I have is from just a couple of years ago. Jim Shooter signed a copy of Secret Wars because he literally had a box of books he had written next to his chair. Because as a writer, what's he going to do? He's not going to do a sketch for you. But speaking of, writers that can draw and do it all, you talked about the art and this framing sequence. And, for me, the best part of this is, there's certainly plenty of words on these pages, plenty of word balloons and captions. They're not necessary, though. I think, it's just the style back then that you had to have more words on the page, but you could look at just the raw drawings on these 4 pages and get it. You wouldn't be missing a beat. Even where they close in on the old man's face in the end, you'd get the feeling like, okay, this guy has something to say and we're about to hear what it is, So he certainly used the captions and the word balloons. I'm not sure how much writing he had done before this issue himself, but it almost just feels like he just felt this was the style. But the drawing is so good, the storytelling is so clear, you don't need hardly any of the words. But now that story is over, we go to the next page and you still see, I think the same drawing of that old man's head down at the bottom of the page with the skulls for eyes. And he is introducing the first reprinted story of this issue. It's called The Fort Which Did Not Return. And that one was reprinted from GI Combat 86, published in 1961. So if you want to do the honors and sum up this story, take us there.
Well, this was the cover story from GI Combat 86. The first panel that you see is actually on the cover of that comic book. And the title of that one was actually The Secret of the Fort Which Did Not Return. Why they felt the need to change the title is beyond me, but there we go. It was written by the late, great Bob Kanigher, as so many of these DC war stories were, and illustrated by Russ Heath. Now, I was just jonesing all over Joe Kubert's art a few seconds.
I was going to say, you don't know much about Russ Heath, do you?
Russ Heath is another one of those individuals that I had the incredible honor to meet. Matter of fact, I actually had him sign my copy of Weird War Tales #1 because he did the art in this first reprint story. And one of the things that I've always loved about Russ Heath is his phenomenal attention to detail. I mean, if the plot called for an ME-109, it was an ME-109. And if there's a Sherman tank driving around in the bushes, it was a Sherman tank. He drew whatever the plot called for. And that was rare in an era where the script said, hey, we need an ME-109. And the artist said, hey, that's nice. I'm going to draw a Stuka dive bomber instead.
I mean, in their defense, these guys had to draw whatever they had reference material for. There was no internet. What do you expect them to do, Rich? Go to the library and actually do research?
But yeah, Russ's style, I mean, I met him at a couple of cons. I got lots and lots of books signed by him. And I'll tell the one story real quick. I needed the last issue of GI Combat that I needed was it was the origin story of the Haunted Tank. So it would, because you know how it goes, the origin story, the first one, that's like, hey, we can get a lot of money for this one. So it was like 3 figures. I'd never spent that much money on a comic book in my life, but it was the last one that I needed. I'm like, oh man, I'm kicking it around back and forth in my head. I'm like, if I finally realized, you know what? Russ Heath did the art on this. Russ Heath is 4 tables away. I can have Russ Heath sign this book and I can justify this expense. So I'm like, all right. So I shell out the money and I buy the book and I go down to Russ Heath's table and he just looks at me. He's like, how much is this at your back? And I'm like,
see him right away.
He was a character. I mean, I had a couple of interesting conversations with him. There's one book I was having him sign, and it was like a weird shaped panel. He says, like, you know how I got the shape of that panel? I traced my coaster.
It's all about resourcefulness.
Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah. So his style is very clean. It's very crisp. It's very accurate. I've always been a huge fan of Russ's art from day one. But anyway, that's enough of the fanboy. Let's get back to the story in question here.
I was going to say the drawing and the first panel here has quite a bit of detail in it.
Oh, yes.
Fort Which Did Not Return.
It is the cockpit of a B-17. There's bullet holes in the pilot seats. The instruments are smashed. The windscreen is shot out, and there's nobody in the cockpit as it's barreling down what appears to be an oil refinery. And there's a word balloon coming up out of one of the pilot's headsets. That's the bombardier to pilot lining up on the target. Watch your drift. Hold it. Very intense scene as the aircraft.
Yeah, like if you're looking at the panel, that, like you said, that dialogue is coming out of an empty headset. So somewhere there's a bombardier that is yelling into what looks to us like an empty cockpit. No one's flying the plane.
Yeah, where did they go? So you turn the page, and the actual story starts with the bombardier returning to his base after a long journey, presumably after having been shot down, being rescued by the resistance forces of wherever he ended up. He's waving to other crew members from other birds as he comes back in. The other airmen come running up to him. It's like, hey, what happened and everything? And he's like, I can't. He's thinking to himself, I can never tell you what really happened. It's just, you wouldn't believe it. And they see the look on his face, and they've seen that look before, so they just leave him alone with his thoughts and everything. And the story starts to flash back to when the Bombardier and his crew boarded their B-17, which was nicknamed the Mother Hen.
Yeah, you get that flashback, the old school flashback where the panel border changes to like a fluffy cloud kind of border.
And service members they get really attached to their plane. As each crew member boards the plane, he taps the nose, and it's like the co-pilot's like, "You'll get us there, Mother Hen." The navigator is just like, "I'll lay out the course, and I know you'll follow it right down the line." And the Bombardier is like, "You're going to lay TNT eggs right down there, smoke sex, Mother Hen." And the waist gunners were like, "We won't let those big bad fighters near you, Mother Hen." And the tail gunner's like, "I'll keep them off of you, Mother Hen." It's all the crew members, getting their lines in and everything.
And they all have to say Mother Hen at the end. They all have to say the name of the plane.
Say, "Gee, I wonder what the name of the plane is. I wonder if they like it." So the aircraft takes off. Nice full panel of filled with B-17s heading off towards the target, and the Mother Hen is heading on towards the target. The navigator is plotting the points, and plane gets right there, right on time. The waist gunners are checking their quadrants. The tail gunner's checking his quadrants. Everything's going all fine and dandy. And the enemy radar picks them up, and the enemy fighters take off. And the German anti-aircraft fire opens up, and the flak is so thick you can get out and walk on it. And it's bad. Planes start going down. Brooklyn Bell gets blown apart. The Powerhouse Pete, 2 engines are on fire. As it goes into like a 45-degree dive and starts heading towards the ground.
The crews, they all said those names so many times. How can anything bad happen?
The fighters are swarming all over them, and one by one, the crew members get taken out by enemy fighters. The tail gunner gets a plane. One of the waist gunners gets a plane, but the one of the planes that he gets explodes so close to the side of the fortress that the shrapnel comes blasting into the fuselage and takes out both of the waist gunners. And the navigator goes running back to check, and there's a hole that you could drive a truck through in the side of the plane. Then both the waist gunners are gone. And so the navigator goes running back to his position. The mission's continuing. Lucky Lulu gets blown out of the sky by enemy fighters. The damage that the B-17 has suffered is severe enough that they're becoming a straggler. So they're on their own. The enemy fighters are just focusing their fire on this one lone bird now. And the tail gunner gets one enemy fighter, and another one comes in and takes out the tail gunner. And then there's an explosion up in the cockpit, and both pilots are wounded. And a fighter on a head-on strafing pass finishes off the 2 wounded crew members in the cockpit. The navigator climbs up to the top turret, engages the fighter, blows him out of the air. But the navigator dies from his wounds afterwards. So, it's down to the Bombardier. And the Bombardier doesn't know he's the only one that's left. But he doesn't know that, like I said. So the Bombardier is calling into his throat mic, "Bombardier to pilot, approaching the target. There it is. Those giant-sized oil tanks. You're taking Mother Hen right over it, Captain. Hold it, hold it, hold it." And that scene is real interesting because the beginning panel said, it's an open cockpit. The words are coming out of an abandoned headset.
Yeah, we have that panel where it's that moment we opened on, like in the moment in the movie that starts, at one point in time, and then obviously you flash back and you're wondering when you're going to catch up to it. Well, we're here, and it's not a lazy copy and paste. This is a different drawing than the one they opened with.
And then bombs away, and there goes the payload, and it blasts the target fiery bits, and the plane heads back through the acres of exploding flak, heading back towards base. And the angrily buzzing fighters, who couldn't understand why a ship which didn't return their fire somehow managed to stagger out of their sights, because the enemy fighters are zooming in on it, shooting it up more, putting more holes into it, and the plane is just banking and swerving away, but no one's shooting back. And finally, the Bombardier comes up to the cockpit, and he's like, he's just stunned. He's like, who took this ship over? How can a Mother Hen keep on going? And he just checks out every fort and every inch of the fort, and just sees he's the only one left. And as it heads towards the Dutch coast, he just bails out, says, "Goodbye, guys." And the last he sees as he parachutes down towards the ground is the fort, disappearing over the horizon with smoke trailing from one of his engines. And he's like, "Take good care of them, Mother Hen."
Yeah, and then we catch up to present day in the story on the last page, or even after the present, like he's ready to go on another mission. He's being assigned to another crew.
Yeah, he's all, you have to imagine what being the lone survivor of a bomber that ideally had 10 people aboard it. In this case, 7, but we'll get into that later. Being a sole survivor, you're going to have survivor skill. And you can tell, again, the looks on his face, he's like, he just doesn't know where to go with this. He's like, what can I tell the guy, this new crew I'm being assigned to? What can I tell them? That a ship without a pilot without a pilot at the controls took me over the target and then turned and flew out to sea with the rest of the crew? It's like, no, I could never tell them what really happened. I would just keep doing my job in another ship. And as I was doing it a week later, bombs away. He just became a replacement bombardier of a new crew. But on this mission, he can imagine that Mother Hen is in the formation with him. And just like, there she is. He'll come back to see how we're doing.
Yeah, and in that final panel, we get the little circle at the end with the catchphrase that I associate very heavily with a lot of the old, especially Kubert helmed war comics I read off of you, with the phrase "make war no more."
Yep. It was a big thing they did back in the 70s. They threw that out there a lot.
Do you must know where that started? Like, when did they first start putting that in the DC war book? To the best of your knowledge, where do you think that began?
I probably knew at some point where exactly that came from. I mean, you got this started, I think it was like the late 60s, early 70s, as I think when they started doing that. And it may have been a not so subtle reference to what was going on in Vietnam.
Yeah, comics are nothing if not subtle.
But I always preferred the DC war books to the Marvel war books or the Charlton war books or whatever. I just always liked the art.
How dare you, sir? You speak bad of Charlton.
I always preferred them, and I've read a lot of like really, really powerful war books, out of DC over the years. But there have been plenty of stories where it's a waste, make war no more. It gets the message across.
Yeah, I definitely prefer that. And speaking of the Marvel contrast, we'll get into the actual advertisements later, but I want to talk about this house ad that takes up the last third of the page here. It says, "Bigger and better, only 25 cents. The Magic of Kirby. On sale July 13th," and it's for a new issue of Mr. Miracle that's about to come out. So there's that contrast right there, like the melancholy DC meditation on, the futility of war, and then the magic of Kirby. Don't ask, just buy it. Right at the bottom of the page. So, as far as what I thought of this first story, because I know that's what we're all dying to know here. Of course, I'd never read this before I got this back issue and read it for the podcast, but I've always been impressed with Russ Heath's art. Particularly what jumped out to me this time around was how his art straddles the line between what I think of as comic book art and newspaper strip art. And I'm talking specifically about, let's see, the second page, the first page after the splash, third panel, the close-up of the bombardier's face. Now, if that's not a newspaper strip adventure hero's face, I've never seen one. The square.
You could pass Superman.
Yeah, the squarest jaw, the 5 o'clock shadow, Superman. But Superman, if he, actually, hadn't shaved for a few days. The Superman that's having a couple shots of whiskey in that bad Superman sequel. The evil Superman at the bar. But still kind of rugged and noble. Just like this is like, I don't know, like your Mark Trail or mixed with a little Buck Rogers. But that kind of hybrid art style that Heath has is on display here, where to me there's, something that's obviously drawn for a comic book page, but with the illustrative style of a newspaper strip. So I really, really enjoyed that. The other thing that stood out to me as someone who I generally like stories, for characters. I'm a character motivation kind of person, but in these little short stories, you're not going to get much of that. And in this one, you don't even get any names. None of these people have names. They just have their position on the plane, the co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier, and that's it. No one's called anything, and then they're all dead. you know?
It might be the odd rank reference, but yeah,
Yeah.
even the waist gunners are saying, here motherhead and purr starboard, cats purr port, but I dig you. I'm like, yeah, it's like, come on, these guys, give us a name.
Yeah, you don't even at least get like the salty military nicknames they would have had. They don't have time for that. They've got like a handful of pages, and at the end, all of them but one are going to be dead. So we have, obviously it's short stories. Like I said, they don't have time for that. But what we have here, and one of the things I'm interested in finding out as I go through these earlier issues, is how fast did the elements of the supernatural get introduced into these stories? Because reading this first issue, it's a little tamer in that regard than I remember it when I came in around issue 68 as a kid. Because here we have a plane that apparently flew itself over a target, turned around and left, and went out to sea by itself with no one piloting it. So there's certainly a hint of a supernatural element there, but you really just have the bombardier's word for it. And at the end, does he see the ghost of the plane, or is he just imagining things? It's all kind of left up to you. So the supernatural element here is maybe present, maybe not. And even if it is present, it's certainly mild. There's no actual ghost or demons or anything involved, like I remember from the later issues. So that's something I'm just going to be interested in keeping track of as we go on. So that kind of wraps up the fort, which did not return. Do you have any closing thoughts about it, or should we get on to what's wrong with this story?
Oh, I think we can launch into Killjoy was here.
That's right. We are going to have a segment on the show called, as Rich just said, Killjoy was here, where he's going to come in at the end and pick out at least one of the more egregious errors in history or military reference that they got wrong in these stories, if there is one. So without further ado, Killjoy, take it away.
Okay, well, first, a little bit of backstory. During World War II, there was a mythical American super soldier named Kilroy who fought on every front of the war. Kilroy was here, would be scrawled on damaged buildings, wrecked hulls, carved in trees, and usually he was accompanied with a weird little animated figure of a top of a head, eyes, and a nose peering over a wall. And
yeah, very menacing figure.
Yeah, not or not. And it became such a part of the experience. I mean, the Killjoy fought on every front of the war for the American forces, and it became such a part of the American experience that when the World War II memorial was built in Washington D.C., the Kilroy was here graffiti was actually added to it in two little places hidden in the back, as kind of like an in-joke to the World War II veterans. Now, people not in on the joke would see it and be like, oh my God, this is terrible. Someone vandalized the World War II memorial, and had to be told, no. It's an in-joke. World War II vets get it. It's a funny. So we have to do the play on words. You have to do the Kilroy was here to Killjoy was here. I have to ruin the fun, about you have to find something that was wrong in this piece of escapism.
Right. Plus, you're just a total killjoy, so it fits.
And there'll be some stories where nothing will lunge out at me, and there'll be other stories where it's just like, man, how much time do I have? So,
I was going to say, we have Russ Heath on deck here, so there must be absolutely no mistakes, right?
Well, I say, usually, unfortunately, Russ must have been off his game a little bit on this one, because the script called for Focke-Wulf 190s, and you drew the aforementioned ME109s, which is, I know, you don't know how many kids reading this comic book would know the difference.
Oh, so you didn't just mention that at random earlier.
But there's that, and we were also mentioning before that 7 crew members were mentioned by name climbing into the fortress. Although in this one panel they show 8 people, but usually a B-17 would have a crew of 10, especially early in the war when they didn't have fighter escort. And they would later in the war, when they had fighter escorts, they would take one of the waist gunners out to save weight. Put another bomb in the bomb bay, a few more gallons of fuel, whatever. But that would still be 9 or 10 people. But in this story that he drew here, they only ID'd 7 people. They showed 8 in this one panel. But later on in the script, they show every gun position, blasting away. The ball turret gunner, which wasn't named, the top turret gunner, which wasn't named, the radio man, which wasn't named. But that's something like that. He could probably, Bob Kanigher could probably get some of that thrown at his feet also. I would have to say that's nitpicky stuff. Actually, I mean, I hold Russ Heath in such high regard. When he does make the odd mistake, I'm sorry, it lunges out at me personally, because he didn't usually make said mistakes.
Yeah, obviously I don't have that historical context. Like, I didn't know how many people are normally on a bomber crew or whatever. But what did stand out even to me is they only point out, I think, like 3 people that their job talks about firing guns. And then later on, there's a panel where one of the bombers is firing back at the fighters swarming around it. And I swear there's like 9 gun placements firing from that plane.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, somebody's got some levers or pulleys or something.
The bombardier and the navigator, if they weren't actively engaged in their jobs, would have guns in the nose that they could fight back with.
Yeah, this plane looks like a porcupine, though, on the panel, just with, gun barrels sticking out all sides of it. It looks like, from the last Starfighter from the 80s, when that spaceship just spins around, does the death flower or whatever, and there's lasers coming out of every point.
Yeah,
that stood out to me even.
Yeah, you look at the one particular frame that I think is the one that you're talking about. The top turret's blasting away with its 250s. The radioman is blasting away with his one. The waist gunners are firing. The tail gunners are firing. Belly gun, the chin turret, the 2 cheek guns are firing. Now, again,
cheek guns.
If you want to be a little bit of a nitpicker, I believe it was usually the bombardier that would fire the chin turret. It was a remote control position that he would operate the levers from a position in the nose to deter head-on fighter attacks. He couldn't do that and shoot one of the cheek guns. There were called cheek guns for a reason. There was a small little position just back from the plexiglass nose a little bit on both sides that would have a 50 caliber machine gun sticking out of it. Because one of the vulnerable points of early models of B-17 was dead on. If you made a head-on attack on a B-17, that was its vulnerable spot. So it took them a couple of models for someone to finally figure that out and start adding machine guns to the nose of the plane so it could actually defend itself.
Well, that sounds like a fun process.
But the cheek guns, they again, like I said, the bombardier and or navigator could use those weapons if they weren't actively engaged in their paying job. But all 3 of these positions are blasting away right now, so I have kind of like the mental image where like the bombardier is using the shooting the chin turret, and the navigator is kind of like astride the nose, like with like one hand on each 50, like not even aiming at anything, just shooting.
All right, well, you ruined my chance to make much more of a cheap joke out of the term cheek guns, so I think we'll just we'll move on to the next story, which is this short little 3-pager called "The Story Behind the Cover." So it's not technically a framing sequence, but it's part of that bit of new material that Joe Kubert wrote and drew for the issue. So we have a little 3-pager that literally is going to do like the title says, and this one does actually have a title, on the top, of the first page, "The Story Behind the Cover." And what we have going on in it here. So you remember the cover has this skeleton wearing, military clothes, but no pants.
German greatcoat.
Yeah, German greatcoat, no pants, boots, helmet. He's got a rifle, and he's attacking and scaring the bejesus out of some American soldiers. So this little 3-page filler is going to tell us the story behind that cover. So what we have here, I've mentioned that, a lot of the existing stories here are reprinted from older books. Well, this section, these 3 pages were reprinted later in Sergeant Rock 401, published in 1985. Now, if you remember how the heck they used these 3 pages in that issue, that's great. If not, I will move on. It just seems like these would be 3 pages out of nowhere in a later issue of Sergeant.
I will. Full disclosure. I did not know that this was actually a reprint. I thought this was just something that Joe Kubert had just gone, hey,
Oh,
And
he did. He did. This was reprinted later
in 401. Okay, got
in
it, got it, got it.
401. So I'm wondering how the
Okay.
heck did they use these 3 pages later in an issue when it's literally the story behind this cover?
Okay.
So we'll have to look into that later on, and maybe one day we will cover Sergeant Rock 401 just to see how they managed to
Well,
this stuff in
as
there.
as I've said, I am DC War Book geek. I've got all of these books salted away in the basement. I can find probably any of these books in question if you gave me 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, well you're gonna have several years before we get to 1985. If we even make it there, so you got time. So in these 3 pages, here's what happens. A German patrol runs headlong into an American patrol. A grenade explodes among them. Who knows who dropped it? Maybe you do because of how the grenade looks, but zip it. And only the German officer, Lance Corporal Mueller, survived. He returns to tell his lieutenant and comrades about the incident, but they shun him for his failure, refusing to even acknowledge him. These Germans are harsh to Mueller. He resolves to take on the enemy alone and does so as the pantsless skeleton from the cover. You see, the reason no one was acknowledging him back at base was that he has been dead this whole time. And we get the make war no more button in the final panel again. And I think that's at the end of every story here. So there's a story behind the cover, but it's not much of a story, really. I think it's just another excuse to fill some pages. Joe Kubert does some amazing drawings on these 3 pages.
Oh yeah.
And, and we have what they've literally already blown the secret of on the cover with that little memo that, Mueller died 2 days ago, but he doesn't know it yet. But that's the twist ending at the end of these 3 pages. So I'll give my review, which I kind of already did. These are 3 cool looking pages, but they did not need to be here.
Yeah, the grade. I mean, like I said, the one panel that you're talking about and the cover, they're really great because there's a GI who his eyes are popping out of his skull. He's like right underneath this guy's feet, and he's given the skeletal German a full burst of Tommy fire, and the bullets are just ripping through him with surprise, no effect because
They're
he's
having an effect on his coat.
yeah, that's about it. But these other there's one other GI. It looks like he's been previously wounded. His arm is all wrapped up in bandages, and he's got this mouth agape. He's starting to run for his life and everything else. Look on his face. It's a pretty good panel.
The drawings are fantastic.
There's no doubt about that at all.
I should mention, though, that this is one of those cases of laziness. This is the exact drawing from the cover.
Yeah.
This is not a redrawing of the same scene. It is the image transplanted in here with different captions and lettering and the "Make War No More" button. But the drawings are amazing. I challenge anyone to find a bad Joe Kubert panel or even singular drawing of one individual object. They don't exist. Every panel in this is incredibly cool to look at. The storytelling is great. But this story itself doesn't have much of a purpose other than, hey, we added 3 pages to that book. So, they're not all going to be winners, everybody. So there's some ads, which, again, we'll get to later. And then we move on to the next story, which Rich is going to do the synopsis for because it's a longer story, and I got away with a 3-pager.
I see the way you did that. Okay, well, this next one, it's called The End of the Sea Wolf. This was reprinted from Star Spangled War Stories number 71 back in 1958. And this was drawn yet again by the late, great Joe Kubert. And we've talked ad nauseum about how awesome Joe Kubert's art is. This is a slightly earlier Joe Kubert style, but it's still Joe Kubert 101. Again, the smoke from the explosions, the whiskers from the U-boat crew that's been at sea for weeks on end, the tension in the panels during the combat scenes. It's It's Joe Kubert. I mean,
Dude, the
like Max,
skin.
I am very, very hard pressed to find bad Joe Kubert art.
It does. It just doesn't exist. The skin on Joe Kubert's faces is already in place here. Like his
Stag
face is.
eyes
Yeah.
from the
Yeah.
commander, and yeah, it's just. But it starts off with a appears to be like a merchant ship or a salvage vessel, as the case may be. He's coming out to sea, and he's looking for a submerged wreck somewhere underneath the North Sea. It's let me see here. The commander of the salvage vessel was a former U-boat commander, and one of his crew members is all like, "Hey, you sank this ship that we're here to raise, didn't you?" And he's like, "Yeah, the ship we are raising to remove as a navigational hazard is one of the many that I sank when I commanded the Sea Wolf." And the crew members like, "I would be so proud to hear the story of your glorious victory, Captain." So we do that little fade back, and
It's Capitan.
yeah, Capitan, yeah, right. So we do the flashback. We go back to 1944, or whenever this U-boat patrol takes place, and the U-boat comes across an Allied convoy bringing supplies to Britain, and it says like, "Hey, there's this merchant ship right in front of me. This is easy meat. I'll just put a torpedo into him," and he fires a torpedo, and the ship turns on a dime and dodges the torpedo. It's like he's all like, "What? That tub evaded our torpedo as if it was a man of war with detection devices and destroyer engines, but that's impossible. Surface, we'll blast her with our deck gun." And the crew member says, "Jawohl, Capitan." So the sub pops up to the surface, and the crew comes out to man the deck guns and engage this Allied merchantman. It's like, "At this range, you cannot miss. Sink that junk ship." So the deck gun starts blasting away and starts blowing holes in the ship, and the ship's crew starts lowering lifeboats and abandoning ship and everything. And then all of a sudden, there's an explosion nearby, and the captain's like, "We're being fired upon." And it turns out this Allied merchantman has a couple of guns on board. It's like, "That tub has concealed guns. It's a Q-boat. It's a heavily armed decoy used to destroy U-boats." Like, I'm pretty sure the guys on board would know that, but hey, that's okay. "Prepare to dive. This time our torpedo will not miss." But before they can dive, one of the deck guns on the Q-ship blows a hole in the sub's hull. And yeah, you can't submerge when you got a big hole in your hull like that. So they had to stay on the surface and engage the Q-ship with their deck guns. So a surface engagement breaks out between the two vessels, between the U-boat's gun crews and the gun crews on the Q-boat. And the U-boat crew's guns are better. Shell after shell screaming into the Q-boat, but still it stays afloat. But the Q-boat's doing its job, because the longer the U-boat is engaged with the Q-boat, that doesn't get too confusing, does it?
The U and the Q. What does the Q stand for?
It was just like a code word. I don't think it ever really meant anything. I think it was some Q-boats were originally designed during World War I, and they were infinitely more successful in World War I than they were in World War II. This is kind of jumping ahead to Killjoy was here. But
Yeah.
World War II Q-boats didn't work. They were much more successful during World War I. World War II, there was like 6 of them, and one of them got sunk, and they didn't sink any U-boats, so they just said, "Yeah, never mind." So this would have been better as a World War I story. But
gotcha. Okay, right on. Go for it.
So anyway, the Q-boat is engaging the U-boat, and the longer they're staying on the surface, duking it out with the sub, the other ships in the Allied convoy are escaping, and it's driving this Q-boat captain out of his mind. How come we can't sink this ship? So finally, all the deck guns on the Q-boat on the Q-ship are knocked out. I mean, the Q-ship has gotten a couple of hits in on the sub on its own, but the ammo on board the Q-ship cooks off, and it's a blaze from stem to stern. And they're all like, "Okay, great, let's go after the Allied convoy." And then they realize that the ship is on a collision course with the U-boat, and the gun crews on the U-boat's deck are just blasting away. "Aim for the waterline, reverse engine, sink that rusty tub." And then we're back to present day.
Yeah, they actually use multiple pictures of El Capitan or Herr Capitan's face, like phasing in to bring us back. It's a weird effect that doesn't work, and I'm pretty sure I never see Joe Kubert try that again.
But so the crew member was all like, so what happened then? You know, it didn't reach you. You sank it, right, Herr Capitan? And the captain doesn't say anything. He just goes over to the side of the ship because the pontoons are in place. Start the crane. Now you shall see for yourself the end of the story. And yeah, it's just like, yes, I sank that Q-boat, but before it went down, and then the big, the 3/4 page panel at the bottom, it took my U-boat with it. You know, the Q-boat rammed the Seawolf, and the two vessels sank interlocked to the bottom of the sea. This is where the caption, the end of the Seawolf, is. It's on the very, very last page with the aforementioned "Make war no more" circle underneath it. And again, this is a really, really good artwork on Joe's part, because the Q ship, it's all looks like it's all covered with like barnacles and seaweed and just jagged holes from the gunfight and everything else. It's a real good piece of real good piece of imagery that he put.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Conclusion of the story.
I was just considering, like, it's obvious the Q boat was not meant to spend a lot of time underwater, so it looks a lot worse for wear than the Seawolf, which was built to, be underwater most of the time. So it still looks pretty fresh, so that was a nice detail on Kubert's part. But again, fantastic drawings in every single panel of this.
And you don't know how much time has gone by from the time the ship was sunk to the time that the salvage crew had to go out and get this thing, out of the navigation lanes or whatever the deal is for why they were hired to move the ships.
Yeah, are we even sure what, are we, like, to a point you mentioned before, are we even sure what war this happened in, because the salvage is happening at a certain time, but do they ever say when this conflict between the Q-boat and the U-boat happened?
The old creepy man simply mentions sometime after World War II, a German salvage vessel steams through the North Sea. So you're certainly led to believe that this was supposed to be a World War II engagement.
Right. Well, we'll save that little statement for the Killjoy section, because I have something to bring up about that. But for me, like, the supernatural element of this story doesn't exist as far as me tracking that. And the ending isn't even a surprise, because they even talk about how the Q-boat is turning to ram them. So when they bring the ship up, the fact that it did it is not a surprise. It's drawn like it's supposed to be this great shock, and the drawing's amazing, but you already know that this is what happened. So it's not much of a twist ending. There's no supernatural element. Again, for me, this is a story that is only saved by the fact that Joe Kubert did amazing work on it. I particularly like, because I'm a comic book design and craft nerd, I particularly love the fact that a lot of these panels don't have borders. It just gives it a really cool look throughout it. Like, a lot of these panels don't have that thick line around them. So that's a cool look for me. The drawings themselves are great, and the fact that there's a certain confidence in having the borderless panel that I really like. And it's mostly the flashback panels that don't have the borders. So instead of that fluffy cloud from the fort which did not return, which is a perfectly fine flashback device to use, they just go for the flashback panels don't have a border because they're in the misty haze of time. So I dug that. I like the drawings. The story was not that impressive to me. So let's finish poking holes in it and call for Killjoy.
Well, like I said, I did my heavy Killjoy already, talking about, Q ships were much more effective in World War I than they were in World War II. There are a few minor little things. It's funny, like the last panel with the two ships interlocked and everything, you can see the sub's name Seawolf is painted on the bow, but it's painted in English. It's spelled SEA space WOLF. If this was a German ship, it would have been one word spelled SEEWOLF. But that's your little nitpick stuff.
Yeah, my big problem with this is they work it in, and again, this was a series cobbled together from reprints. Like, it was somebody's idea to reuse stories to sell another book. That's fine, but man, do some work on your framing sequence. Like, this has the old man who's part of the framing sequence, inserted into the first panel, as we've mentioned, telling the young soldier his story, saying, sometime after World War II. Now, the young soldier he's telling this story to was wandering through the woods alone in 1944. So now he's telling this kid a story about the future. That just stood out to me.
It's like, wait, what?
So after this story, there's a one-page text piece that we're going to mention called End of a Convoy. End of a Convoy. I can't hardly even say it, and I certainly didn't read it, and neither did Rich. And I don't recommend anyone read these one-page text pieces or however many pages they all ended up being.
Well, I mean, I did read it just to,
How dare you?
just to cover it. Well, you got to cover it, And it's a hyper glorified version of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Allied air power versus Japanese convoy, and we kicked the living snot out of them. And yay us, and moving on to the next story.
And there was much rejoicing. Good Lord. Yeah, these text pieces, I don't even think that they're worth doing the research about, but I understand somewhere in my comic damaged mind, they were put into these comics as like a way to satisfy some kind of shipping requirement or something so they could classify them differently and get a discount on. It's some nonsense. They're in there for no good reason, and they're all bad wherever you find them. So anyway, we're going to move on to the next actual comic book story in here, which is called Baker's Dozen. And this one does not have art by Joe Kubert, and yet it is actually really, really good. It was reprinted from Star Spangled War Stories number 116 from 1964, and the creative team for Baker's Dozen, the writer's last name is Herron, Herron, someone I've never heard of, but we have some Irv Novick art here. And this stuff is great. I'm a big fan of the guy. He wasn't someone I knew a lot as a kid. I hadn't seen a lot of his work when I was younger, but I have seen a lot of it now in these days of incredibly easily available reprints and stuff.
It's Ed Herron and Irv Novick.
Yeah, Ed Herron. When do we ever see that guy again?
No, we say that now, and he's going to be
he's going to be in every issue of this series.
The next 7 issues, he's going to be in at least one of them, and we'll be the jerks, right?
Yeah, he's going to be the guy that wrote my favorite stories in all these books, because I love this story, by the way. So Ed Herron already deserves an apology from me, but Irv Novick does a great job all the time. So, and he does one in this story as well. So this one's called, again, Baker's Dozen, and the old man is introducing it at the top. He looks kind of tired and sad. The way his face is reproduced here, the lines coming down from the corners of his eyes look like tears streaming down his face. I don't think that's intentional. It's actually kind of funny looking. But
I'm not 100% sure Joe Kubert did the art for that either. So,
yeah, if he did, it was just inked badly or reproduced all smudgy. The printing process was terrible. But the old man brings us in with this word balloon. Baker Company's 12-man patrol was the Army's toughest and most superstition-ridden, but I'll let it go. Superstitious-ridden. Their 0 hour was not D-Day, but Friday the 13th, when a 13th man joined them to make a blockbuster booby trap, adding up to Baker's Dozen. That just doesn't flow all that well, despite the fact that I hardly got through that word balloon. But it also kind of blows the plot a little too much. Like, you don't have to be told that this is going to happen. So we have the title Baker's Dozen, and then we have a splash panel that takes up the rest of the page. And right away, we have something that gets my goat right there. We have some anti-black cat prejudice going on in this first panel. There's a soldier that's, leaning, he's kneeling down on the road, comforting and petting a black cat as a plane drops down and onto him and his company and is firing away, and his fellow soldiers are cursing his name. They're like, unlucky 13th jinxed us. He must have flipped to pet that black cat. Yeah, he sure attracted that buzzard to us. And, that's going to get across the main theme of the story right there, which it does a great job for a splash panel. You get kind of the gist of the story right there. So, we've got the black cat prejudice. So I'm already kind of pissed off and engaged. And
Hey,
ready to,
Max, why don't you tell the listeners what kind of pet you
oh, I have two cats,
have?
and I have two female cats, Penny and Calypso. I'm a big pet person. I'm a big cat guy. I'm just a big animal person. So right away, when these soldiers are giving him the business for stopping to pet a cat and blaming him for attracting an enemy plane, I'm ready to be like, what, buddy, pick up that cat, leave those guys to their fate. So, we get beyond that splash panel. And like I said, it did a great job. I'm already up and I'm ready to go. So the rest of the story it goes like this. Before they are sent to check out a nearby town, a 13th soldier is assigned to the most superstitious squad ever. And on Friday the 13th, even, just like the old man said. And we meet the crew. We have Sarge, who is wearing a helmet that says Lucky 7 on it. And he introduces some of the rest of his crew as he's complaining about having this 13th person added. We have Horseshoe Jones, Four Leaf Clover Benson, Rabbit Paw Prescott, and Wishbone Wilson. So there's 5 of them. And so you couldn't hit this any harder on the nose if you wanted to. And they just kicked number 13 out. They never even call this guy by his name. He's just, the 13th or 13. And, they kick him out, but he is sent back. Meanwhile, this Baker company, has been shelled while approaching the town they were sent to check out. And on the way running back from the shells, a black cat crosses their path. And then 13 rejoins them. And he reveals that he's a demolitions man. And that only makes Sarge angrier, because he's like, you're a walking bomb. You're going to get us all killed. Like they're not in a war already, So he makes 13 take point. Of course, 13 stops to pet the cat, so we're back at the splash panel now, and the German plane sees him and goes for the squad. Now, 13 shoots down this plane single-handedly, but the squad still curses him out because some of the debris fell their way and, I don't know, like messed up their hair or something. I'm not incredibly sympathetic to the rest of 13's squad here. 13's nice to cats. He's the good guy. So they keep moving, and 13 decides to rest up against a hay bale in this field. And of course, that hay bale has a tank hiding inside it, which, good on that tank. That's pretty sneaky. The tank's causing havoc. The squad is cursing out 13 for supposedly triggering the tank. 13 sets fire to the hay with his rifle, and the tank explodes, I guess.
The hay catches fire when he shoots at it with his
Tommy
gun.
It. Yeah.
And the tank goes clanking out. So he's still shooting at the rest of Baker Company, and the burning hay is hanging all over the tank, and it causes the tank to explode. Because that happened all the time.
Right. So we'll get to that, I bet. But the squad still accuses 13 of trying to kill them with a flaming tank bomb or something, even though he again just single-handedly saved their bacon. So they move him to another position. They keep moving him around because they think that'll solve the problem. They move 13 to the right flank, and they're going through the town, and he panics. I'll give them this. He shoots a mirror in a doorway that he mistakes for an enemy soldier. So, this superstitious squad, of course, they're talking about 7 years bad luck and all that, and just another way 13's putting their lives at risk. So they move him to the rear of the squad, and a German paratroop detachment, or whatever you call them, a bunch of German paratroopers with 12 shoots in a tank, adding up to the number 13, is dropped down. Now, the squad assumes this is also somehow 13's fault. Like, he's the only one that this passing paratrooper, force could have possibly seen. So while they're panicking, and scattering, 13 backs into a cab, like, a car on the road with the license plate 13-13, again, subtlety. And he gets in, he drives it straight at the tank. Now, his good friends in the squad, they, the actual word balloons are, look, the Jinx is sacrificing himself for us. And the other ones are like, he ain't so bad. So yeah, now
The
that
word balloon with like the 3 or 4 arrows coming off it,
yeah,
like the rest of the squad sing it in chorus. He's not so bad.
yeah, he ain't so bad. He's gonna die for us. Finally something useful. So
Freaking
you
hero.
know, then 13, yeah, he jumps out of the cab before it runs into the tank, and the squad decries his cowardice and goes right back to whining and cursing his name. But then, the fact that the charges that 13 left in the cab explode and the tank is destroyed, because they seem to have forgotten he was carrying a ton of explosives on him. So again, he saves their bacon. Presumably, they can handle the paratroopers because after that, after the tank is destroyed by 13's exploding car, the squad accepts him and everything is fine, with these bunch of jerks. And the story is over. So, that
Make
is
war, no more.
yeah, we have our Make War No More button. And at the bottom, we have another one of these house ads that I love. It takes up the bottom third of the page. Bigger and better. One to startle you. Only 25 cents on sale July 20. And it's an issue of Justice League America with Solomon Grundy on the cover, just making short work of the assembled heroes. And it is one of those crossover issues with the JLA and the Justice Society. This isn't a thing I'd become aware of until some early 80s issues of the JLA with, some George Perez art in them. But it's just one of my favorite things in this era of DC Comics is when the JLA would meet the JSA. So I get a pretty big charge out of that. So I like the story. I like the Irv Novick art. Let's get into what you thought about it before we call Killjoy back to the front lines.
Well, there was just jumping into the slight historical perspective aspect of this first is the phonetic alphabet actually changed after World War II. Now it starts Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, yada, 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 yada. But back then, it was Abel, Baker, Charlie, Dog, Easy, Fox, yada, 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 yada. So actually,
Easy. Okay, all right.
yeah, so actually the Baker's Dozen in the title is actually a cute multi-tiered play on word. Baker's Dozen, 13, So that was actually quite clever if you if you want to play that way.
Yeah, things that don't quite survive the decades, but Rich is
because
here to help out.
Yeah, because you'd have to know about the phonetic alphabet changing. Again, the Sergeant Rock crowd is obviously well familiar with the whole "nothing is easy" and easy comment, but I'm not really sure how well that will work now. Nothing echoes an echo. I don't know. Give me a minute. Yeah, but as far as Killjoy was here, oh my God, where do you start? I mean, I could probably find something on each single page, of this story, but I'm not going to do that. I already ridiculed the tank exploding, after driving through a flaming haystack. I'm like, what was the tank made out of? Balsa wood. But the one thing I'll point out is the first thing that number 13 did was he shot down a low strafing a German fighter with his Tommy gun.
The man was a hero.
Yeah, it was like I said. I mean, it's just because that happened all the time, and I always love these panels where it's just like we know comics are escapism, and the laws of physics don't apply. Cough, cough. Captain America's shield. Cough, cough. But if this guy was coming in as hard and as fast as he was coming at the angle that he was coming in on these guys at, this guy wouldn't have had to have shot him down. He would have plowed into the ground. He would have plowed into the ground on his own. It was just there's all kinds of just little things like that. But that's what makes war comics fun, isn't it? Is the good guys win, the bad guys die. Let's move on and make war no more. So
yeah, there's at least as much realism in a story like this as there was in like the war movies of the time or maybe the decade before. You didn't come to this stuff for the incredible accuracy.
So yeah, I mean, like I could say a few other things, but we'll just let it be and just move on.
Yeah, I got to ask you one thing before we move on to the final
All right.
piece of this book. Did they ever try to hide a tank in a pile of hay?
It's camouflage. I would imagine they would have done that all the time because the whole thing it's cover. Cover and concealment. Concealment hides you from the eyes of the enemy. Cover hides, it actually protects you from enemy fire. Now a haystack isn't going to protect you from enemy fire, but it will keep enemy eyes off of you. I mean, at this stage of the war, Allied air power, the Allies ruled the skies. I mean, the Germans had no shortage of problems, moving stuff from point to point, by this time of the war, because our aircraft were everywhere. So this tank was probably just hiding in a haystack just to avoid from being obliterated by an Allied fighter bomber or something.
Yeah, it's literally just waiting for some Americans to try to cross this field.
Yeah.
All right, so that is possible. For me, not knowing the nitty gritty of the military history, I was like, did they just say we're going to stick this tank in a bale of hay and hope someone walks by here? I mean, I understand they probably know that this town is at a strategic point that's likely to be investigated.
Haystack, but yeah, it would have. Yeah, I mean, it would have made sense. This was a defensive war at this point. They would have been doing ambushes and stuff like that. So,
yeah, I did get invested in the story though. I was on 13's side from panel 1. I hated all these dudes, even though they were on the side of the good guys in the war. I just wanted at least one of them to get an arm blown off or something,
You could play the old infamous, oh, this is the freaking new guy. He's the replacement. He doesn't know anything. He just replaced Johnny that just got both his legs blown off when he stepped on a landmine.
Yeah.
All the built-in animosity towards the new guy that you just instantly assume doesn't know anything.
And they just took the shorthand of superstition, which allowed all these ridiculous, convenient coincidences to happen. But again, the Irv Novick art, I love it. There's similarities between him and Don Heck to me, in that Irv, and at least maybe whoever's inking here too, does a lot of these sketchy, feathery lines that other people, if they do it, it looks rushed. But when, Irv and someone like Don Heck does it, it just gives things this more immersive kind of realistic look that I really dig. The drapery of the uniforms, the expressions on the faces. Obviously Joe Kubert's in this book, so he is the best artist in the book. But man, there's no sneezing at this stuff. This is great comic book art, page design, everything. It's just really good. And Killjoy stuff aside, this was my favorite actual story in the book. And then we're going to go on to our framing sequence. The end of the story, the end of the book, is called You Must Go. But again,
dun, dun, dun.
It's not really a title. It's just something the old man is saying in the first panel of these final 2 pages. This is just a 2-page framing sequence. That's all we've got left here. And there's a shot of the house that the young soldier from the beginning has wandered to, and now he's healed up a little more from listening to these stories, and God knows how many others he's had through. There's a nighttime shot of the exterior, and you see the word balloons. It has been many hours since you arrived, and the night is almost gone, and so are my stories. Soon dawn will be here. You must go. And
all bold lettering.
Yeah.
You must go.
So, the young man takes his leave, and I want to draw one thing here that I didn't bring up, and the fort which did not return, but this is the second time it happens in here. So I guess it's just something that they did in older comics, and maybe just in older writing. When the young soldier is leaving, he's waving back toward the old man's house, and he says, "Goodbye, thank you." And the old man says, "Goodbye, perhaps we shall meet again." But each time they say goodbye, there's no E at the end. It's GOODBY. And earlier, when the bombardier is bailing out of, the mother hen, he says goodbye to the mother hen, and they write it without the E. Now, I'm an English major. That just stands out to me, and I've never seen that before as far as I know in my life. So I don't know if that's something you've noticed. You read a lot of older war comics than me. Is that something that's ever stood out to you?
Well, I noticed it, reading the comic. I didn't, put anything, I didn't apply a whole lot of thought to it, honestly, because language evolves with time and stuff like that. 2 words become 1 word, the word, the letter at the end drops off, a hyphen disappears, language evolves. I honestly couldn't tell you. I always spelled it with an E. I've seen it usually spelled with an E at the end. Yeah, I
Yeah, because honestly, when I first saw it in that first panel, I read it mentally for a split second as Goodby. I'm like, is he calling Mother Hen Goodby? Like, are you a good doobie or something? But then I realized he's saying goodbye to the plane. And then later I'm like, well, that's probably just a typo. And then here it's twice in one panel. So anyway, that Rich is going to be a killjoy for the military and historical stuff, and I'm probably going to do that for grammatical, and spelling errors and things like that. Because hey, I got to use that degree for something. So the young guy leaves. He's been there for several hours and is apparently healed enough to get the heck out of the house now. He hits the trail. He's wandering through the still darkness shrouded misty woods, even though the sun is approaching, and he comes across a villager gathering firewood, and he says, "You
old
there?"
hag.
Yeah, well, old hack, you say that, but I took a note when I saw this panel. I imagined him going, "Old woman," and then I imagined the old woman saying, "Man," because that is exactly what this looks like. It looks like Eric Idle from Monty Python's Holy Grail when King Arthur rides up on a peasant doing some drudge work on the side of the road. He's got this, cloaked
Oh, we got
robe
some
on.
lovely filth down here.
Right.
We're
So
both Monty Python fans. Probably going to be dropping some Python-esque humor here and there.
I mean, with this, it was impossible not to make the connection. I was almost going to say, when did the Holy Grail come out and when was this book published?
About the same time period.
Yeah.
Actually.
So, old woman, man. And so, the young soldier who doesn't have a name, nobody has any names in this book, says, "You there, which way to the road?" And, the old person says, "Straight ahead, but where did you come from?" And he's like, "Oh, just the cottage behind me where the old man lives." And, of course, the villager is shocked and says, "No one lives in that house, not now. Many years ago during the First Great War," so we do have finally a reference to which war is which here, "a man lived in that house. A shell landed on it and killed the man on the very last morning of the war." The young soldier's like, "That's impossible." And he turns around, and of course the house is right there. Like we get the impression he's been wandering away for a while, but it's still just right back there. And it's just a blasted foundation with a few timbers sticking out of the ground. There's nothing left of it.
The smokestack, a couple other, like corner beams, and the rest of it's just rubble. And he has this look of, huh?
Yeah, and we get the
shock on his face.
We get the ending caption, 1944, winter. A wounded soldier hobbles down a road. Behind him, he has left the dark woods and heads toward the war. And we have the Make War No More button. We have the next issue on sale on or about September 23rd. I love that, on or about. Like, this is comic books. Let's not try to be too specific here.
Well, the funny thing is, if you look at that tagline, it looks like the font changes, to next issue on or about September 23rd. So it's like whenever they decided to, I don't know, maybe incorporate this story into the book or something like that. Maybe this came from something else.
Yeah.
We're just going to put our little green whiteout on here and just type in a new date.
It really, yeah, it does look like some kind of paste up shenanigans because the rest of that line is in bold, and then the date is in very almost faint looking normal typeface.
Match. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good catch there. That they were just like, I don't know, this date, and then they went, nope, tape this one down over it because these are old comics. This stuff was done literally by taping things and gluing them to the page and pasting them up and stuff like that. So yeah, that's tacked right on. So that's the end of the actual content, the story content for Weird War Tales #1. We have begun our journey, but that's only part of the fun of reading old comics. We've got advertisements in here, people. That, as anyone who's a fan of old comic books knows, is at least half the fun of going back through them. So I want to hit a few of them. And, Rich, you can bring up ones as you page through. And, the one right on the inside of the front cover is just one of those ads. You saw a ton of these kinds of things. It was like, sell some garbage and turn in your receipts for these junk prizes. And, God knows how many of these there were, but this was called the Sales Leadership Club. And I finally read the fine print, not the fine print, but even just the details. Because as a kid, I just looked at all the prizes and went, wow, those look cool. And then I moved on with
that tape recorder player if I sell 18 boxes of blah.
Yeah, I didn't even know what they were asking you to sell. Like, I was just looking at the prizes and I went, those look neat. And then I moved on with my life because I had a comic book to read, But as I found out digging into this ad, you were supposed to sell boxes of Christmas cards to your friends and relatives. Not only that, but this ad specifically says you are going to sell people actual Christmas cards. Like, these aren't make-believe fake Christmas cards. These aren't phony. These don't say happy holidays or whatever. These are actual Christmas cards. And so you were supposed to, foist these off on your family to try to get like a musical birdcage jewelry box, or whatever else these prizes
Wonder wristwatch.
Yeah, just horrible stuff. Like, this Sales Leadership Club, I think I wrote down a few of these dumb prizes that you could get. Like, there was a cadet sleeping bag that I think you should check out to see if they got that right. Now, one of the things I noticed a disparity of is you could get a gas-powered Honda ATC for selling 6 boxes of these Christmas cards, right? So this thing is gas-powered. It's an all-terrain vehicle. Although it says ATC, I'm not sure why it doesn't say ATV, other than it's probably 3 inches high.
Yeah, it would almost have to be that because, all you need to do to get this thing is sell 6 boxes. Yeah. Meanwhile, the prize right next to it, which is the bike radio horn light combo, you need to sell 12 boxes.
Right. I wrote down as a contrast, there's a high riser fun bike, which is just a kid's bike, and that's 24 boxes. So, there's that disparity right there. So immediately I'm like, I need to know what the deal is with this Honda thing. And then one of my favorites, it's almost there, like I feel on purpose. You can get a snare drum and cymbal for 12 boxes. So then you can get it and you can do your own rim shot. Like this. So that was one of my favorites. Was like right when you open the book, you got that ad.
The one thing that as I'm listening to you and I'm looking at the prizes and stuff like that, the placement of this ad is actually it's the worst possible place in the book because the business reply mail coupon that you have to cut out to send with it, it's on the inside cover of the comic book.
Which that is an excellent point. Yeah.
You are cutting off literally about a quarter of the cover of this comic book. And I would be like, no, I'm not going to cut off a corner cover of my comic book. Maybe like an inside page or something like that, especially if it doesn't affect a story. And as going back and collecting old back issues of war comics, I hate, buying a book and flipping through it and seeing someone cut out a coupon, and especially if it cuts into a story. And I'm like, oh, to me, that means I need to find another one of these comics and replace this piece of garbage because I don't know what happened there. So that would have really affected my ability to participate in these little programs if I had to cut a quarter of the cover of the comic book.
Yeah, just that's a great point. Just incredibly bad placement. And it's the Sales Leadership Club, everybody, was based in Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, I've lived near Springfield, Massachusetts, and I got to tell you, this seems like something that would be based out of Springfield, Massachusetts. It's, they're probably still active coming from there. Now, the next ad we run across is for something I never played, I never saw. I didn't know what the heck to make of this ad. Something called Skittle Baseball. It's like a little tabletop baseball game with a ball attached to a pole. Looks like a tether ball. Just insane. It made me think of like, God, the things that we would play with in the 70s and be perfectly happy.
Well, even the logo for Skittle Baseball is just screams 1970s. It's all block letters, and the top half of it is Star Spangled Blue, and the bottom half of it is white and red stripes. It's all so shriekingly patriotic.
Yeah, it's America's pastime. Apparently, slapping a plastic ball on a cheap chain at your friend who is waiting to slap it back at you while you're about to break this toy. Like from Aurora, who did all those model kits that everyone's super nostalgic about. But I bet nobody still has one of these things.
Like just a paragraph that's underneath it is good for a laugh. It's like, you'd call it Skittle baseball because that's what it is. Skittle baseball is just like baseball. Oh, you play it the Skittle way. One player pitches the ball, the other player tries to hit it into the outfield for a single or double or homer or maybe an out. Skittle baseball. It takes big league skill to win from Aurora, where fun is the name of the game.
I want you to read that ad copy to anyone who tries to call you on the phone. That's I love you'd call it Skittle baseball because that's what it is. And you'd call it that, dummy, because you call things what they are. I love the copywriting in these things. So Skittle baseball, I am now determined to figure out what the hell
you need to go onto eBay once we conclude this session and see if you can find Skittle baseball.
The next time we see each other, we're playing this damn game. So we paged through the issue, and there's a bunch of other stupid ads. I don't want to dwell on everyone, but like finish high school at home. There's a haunted house record. Get a bag of coins. Here's a bag of random coins, you dummy. Send away for this. But then we get to this 2-page spread of something that haunted me when I saw it. It was scarier than anything in the actual stories. It was now yours from Columbia at truly great savings. Any 8 tapes or records for only $3.98. Yes, Columbia House is in here. And they're selling not just 8 tapes, but you can take your pick between 8 tracks, tape cassettes, reel-to-reel tapes, or 12-inch LP records. Columbia House was selling people reel-to-reel audio tapes. Like, at best, you're going to run into people our age now that remember these guys as the people who were hawking CDs that you could never stop the subscriptions to. But here we have, God knows when they got started, but this has to be the beginning or close to it, because
they mentioned 8-track cartridges and stuff too.
Yeah.
Because it's the 70s. Because everyone, eight tracks was where it was at in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, we had the cars in our family throughout different members of there were 8-track players in those cars, man. But like the reel to reel is what stuns me. The fact that you could order that from Columbia House just stood out to me. And the albums are just, you zoom in on these albums and they're just a journey into madness. Like there's a Jim Neighbors album on here called Everything is Beautiful. I need it. I need to find that on YouTube at least and listen to that. Jim Neighbors, Everything is Beautiful. We need that record. That is the record we need in these times. So you get the Columbia House thing, you get something else I'd never heard of, the Supersonic Power line from Kenner. These are these friction-powered race cars where you'd like put a strip into like a gyro and pull it back and send your car racing across. I had a toy like this when I was a kid, but it was the Evil Knievel cycle that you'd rev him up, either in this grinder or like just pull a strip through the bike and he would run across the room and smash into the wall just like you would in real life.
These are the toys you torment your dog or your cat with.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's like this whole line of SSP, Kenner racers. They couldn't have lasted that long because I don't remember these being an option. Like I said, I had the Evil Knievel thing, but that was literally the only toy I had that worked like that. And, how did you ever hear of these things, or you were just aware of like these kinds of toys and that's it?
Been too long at this point.
Yeah.
I might have had one of these floating around in my toy box that don't look horribly familiar.
Yeah.
I'd actually go on a limb and say probably not. I don't think.
And later on in the issue, we have one of those buy a page full of gag ads, page full of gags, and I'm going through them again, and this is the classic one with like the gum that will
Turns your
make
tongue
smoke
black.
or whatever. Yeah, leaves your tongue black. But I'm going through the ad and I'm starting to notice like a trend here. And I made a little list of these things. Yeah, it's the Honor House Production Corporation, I believe is what they were called. Like I actually looked at what they were called now again, because I didn't look at the company name when I was a kid. But some of these gags on the page, there's X-ray specs, there's a spy scope, there's see behind glasses, and a manual on how to learn hypnotic control. So, the creepy, perverted stalker starter kit. Like, that's just disturbing to see. Like, I was like, oh my God, that's just like the date rape starter kit. Just the 70s, man, just right there on one page. So you get past that and we get to, for me, there's two big ads that I want to talk about. And one of them is right after the last story page. And there's a link here to something that we've talked about a bit. Is there's a link here, I guess, tangentially to Russ Heath, because this isn't his work on this ad, but I think he was very he was very famous in comic book circles for being the guy who drew those ads for those little cardboard footlockers of plastic soldiers you could send away for either Roman soldiers or World War II or Civil War, and the drawings looked amazing, and you ordered the footlocker, which I actually did for one of them because the drawing was so incredibly cool, and the box was crap, and the soldiers were paper thin plastic. They weren't even three-dimensional. They were awful. So we have an ad for something like that here. We have a split ad, two different sets. One is called Tank Trap and the other is called Cannonball. So we have like what looks like a World War II set of soldiers, and then we have like a Civil War set. It says Cannonball, and it says here, this game is dedicated to the fighting heroes of Chickamauga, the blue and the gray, And so again, like this is the first time I saw one of these ads that didn't have, I believe, those incredibly famous Russ Heath drawings.
Yeah, it's not as art. The art is looks like they even got different artists for the World War II display and the Civil War display. I mean,
the World War II artist is much better. Yeah,
much better. But that's a funny thing too. You're looking at the coupon for this stuff, and it's from Helen of Toy. I'm like, oh, gee.
That was my favorite part of the ad. Yeah, right there.
Points for pun damage. Right?
That's the only good part of this ad. The Civil War art is so bad. The guys look like they're having a blast. That's the lead soldier that's closest to the viewer.
Oh, yeah.
It just looks like he's having a great time.
Oh yeah, he's got that creep show smile and everything else like that. It's like, hey Timmy, do you want to get into the ice cream truck with me?
Yeah, just not good. And $1.50 to be incredibly disappointed by these things. But so there's that. It stood out to me in that I didn't realize anyone else ever drew ads for these little footlockers of crappy soldiers. And then I realized how lucky I was that I had seen the much better art for those ads when I was a kid. But we get, to me, the star ad in this book is on the back cover. Now, do you want to read some of the copy for this? Or do you want me to dive into this, man? Because this was my favorite ad.
Well, it's an ad for one of those groove race car flat tracks that I think just about every boy had. Late 70s, early 80s. God knows I had one. But it's called a Fat Track, and it shows your new Indy Eagle and your new March Formula One race cars and Camaro Trans Am and Firebird Trans Am and Sizzler's cars running on Fat Track. All the excitement of real racing. It's kind of hard to believe.
Yeah, were these cars these were just like Hot Wheels type cars, right? You just sort of
they were about
pushed them.
They were about the same size, and it would be like almost like a tongue and groove. There would be like a needle that would stick out the nose of the car that would sit into a groove that was on the track. If this is the same type of track that I'm thinking of, and you would have, you plugged in the electricity and you have the little box on the side, and with the accelerator, and the cars just go zipping around and round and round and round. And
so it's this is like slot cars. I'm thinking of a.
I think that's what this reminds me of.
Yeah.
You
All
know,
right.
high-speed cornering on banked curves, Sizzlers fighting for the lead on straightaways, 3 cars wide. Race your own Sizzlers or one of these 4 new models on Fat Track Sizzlers. Fat Track, it's big, black, fat, and fast. From Mattel.
Yes, it certainly is.
And you're
That
gonna have me do all these voiceovers, aren't you? Because you're just
yes, you're gonna if I really enjoy the hell out of some ad copy, you are going to be the one to read it because man, that's what won it for me. Is not only is it just Fat Track, Sizzlers Fat Track, but the tagline right there in the ad is it's big, black, fat, and fast. And you missed one part.
Oh, I missed that
Tyson,
one on
in
purpose.
the
I left
middle.
that one for you.
Yeah, because not only is it big, black, fat, and fast, but the track itself is called out for having a big O layout for Sizzler's owners. This will give you the big O, and it's big, black, fat, and fast. Like that can't have been an accident, any of that. So that, as high points go, so to speak, as climaxes go, I'll say that's a good one to end on. So looking back on Weird War Tales #1, I enjoyed it. I'm digging getting into these early issues to see what this book was like way before I encountered it. A good 7 years before my time with the book began. I gotta say it's even more different than I was expecting. Because by the time I ran into the book, my first cover had a straight up dinosaur lifting a boat out of the water and shaking soldiers out of it like for fun. And nothing like that happening in this book just yet. I mean, granted, these are reprints from old stories. There's some implied ghost shenanigans going on in the framing sequence. So there's a little bit of that supernatural working in. I liked it. I liked the art more than any of the stories. Baker's Dozen was the winner for me. That got top marks. Overall, like I said, the art in every story here was incredible. There's just a murderer's row of kick-ass talent in this book. So I'm just hoping that once we get past the 7 issues of reprint material, that we kick in the octane on the story end. So
Yeah. Well, you got to also remember, I think that there were time periods later in the 70s where there would just be breaks in the action, and there might be the odd book, like episode, 23, might be an all reprint volume, and issue 52, 53, and 54 might be all reprint volumes or something. It just all depended. I seem to recall that when I was reviewing these books, as I was reading them, there was a bunch of these books that were all just like issues like 1 through 7 that were all reprints. But we'll deal with it as we
well,
get.
yeah, when we looked into it, the first 7 issues of this book, it was mostly cobbled together reprint material until it ended up, the sales numbers came in, and whoever was in charge of this project, if this was Kubert's baby or somebody else's, they were given the go-ahead to, have a budget to actually get some more new material, make the book all new. So they had to prove themselves first. This book was just filling a slot on the stands in the publishing schedule. And, and I'm glad they did it, because this became for 5 years straight one of my can't miss books once I encountered it in 78. I read it from 78 right till it ended. So I'm really pleased with how good this book was, how well it held up, and I'm looking forward to diving into #2. So, do you have any final comments?
No, I think we're okay. Actually, I think as like I said, I love the Kubert stuff. I don't know if I had a true favorite story. I mean, I honestly, if I had to choose between the Seawolf story or the Fort which did not return, I would probably lean towards the Fort story. Because I've always loved the B-17 in and of itself. I've been up in one. I had a great uncle that flew 32 missions in one. Out of Italy during World War II, and got all of his stories and stuff like that. It's a marvelous plane. Yeah, so I'd probably have to say the Fort which did not return would probably be
Oh yeah,
my favorite.
that's easily better than the Seawolf. Like I said, the Seawolf just doesn't even have a surprise at the end. There's nothing to it. And with the fort, you've got incredible Russ Heath art. You've got some implied supernatural shenanigans. It's just
a personal attachment.
But like, it's just a much better story. But man, yeah, it's you didn't pick the correct story because the Baker's Dozen has a cat in it, so it wins. So that's that. That is the final verdict.
I'm a dog guy, dude. You know that.
That's the final verdict. And I'm going to do the editing, so that's where it'll stand. So until next time, people, this has been the Weird Warriors podcast with Max and Rich. We've covered Weird War Tales #1. We're going to do it again. So until next time, make war
no more.